Thanks, Randy, for having me. I'm excited to be here to talk about, I think, a pressing issue for anybody interested in data disaggregation, and that's the shift to differential privacy as the statistical disclosure limitation that the Census Bureau is implementing for the 2020 census, and I have a lot to say about it. I could talk for a long time, but I'm going to have to speed through this to get through it all in 20 minutes. It's very technical, but if people have questions later, I'll be around. But my name's Dave Van Riper. I'm the Director of Spatial Analysis at the Minnesota Population Center. Work on mostly our small area statistics products, and have been there for almost 20 years now. Never thought I'd say those words, but I do. So I want to first acknowledge that this work is not only me. I have a team of collaborators at Minnesota: Tracy Kugler, Jose Pacas, Jonathan Schrader, Steve Ruggles, and Kathy Fitch, who have all given feedback and provided input on this presentation. So I'm going to go over four things today. I'm going to talk about what is differential privacy, apply it to data. How does it work? I think one of the things that's been difficult for data users to understand is how is Census going to implement differential privacy? What does it mean? The traditional techniques that Census has used include swapping. They move households from one area to another so that you can't re-identify people. They use top coding on income, so you don't know what someone's actual income is. You can't actually find out Bill Gates' income in the data because they top code it. And these traditional techniques they've used, they've gone away from that for reasons that I won't go into today. Then I'm going to talk about the types of decisions that Census has to make. And I'm going to hammer home the idea that this is actually a lot of policy decisions that are actually probably more important than the technical implementation. And I think we've heard a lot about the technical implementation from Census. We know very little about how the policy decisions are going to be made. And I want to articulate those today because I think people in this room could be good advocates for trying to engage with Census on how that process is going to work. And finally, I'm going to go through 3 examples of data that I've created and that Census have created to show how your analytical results may change depending on decisions that are made regarding some of the policies. Okay, so what is differential privacy? So I'm a geographer by training, and I don't use a lot of formulas on my slides, but this is the one formula you're going to see today. Differential privacy is actually a formal or mathematical definition of privacy, and I think my discussant will do a better job mentioning this, but it's essentially this idea that the information that you can glean about an individual who participates in a database is less than e to the epsilon value, and that epsilon value is what the Census Bureau calls their privacy budget or privacy loss budget. I'll use those terms a little bit interchangeably today. But the key thing to know is that the higher epsilon is, the larger it is, the less noise gets infused into data, which means it will be more accurate. Okay, so big epsilon, more accurate data. Low epsilon equals lots of noise injected into the data, which means less accurate statistics. And for people interested in small subpopulations, that's going to be a real problem for you all going forward. Just as importantly, what is differential privacy? What isn't it? One, it's not an algorithm for statistical disclosure control. Many algorithms can be differentially private or not. So an algorithm on its own can be considered differentially private or not. And so the Census Bureau has developed an algorithm that they call top-down that implements differential privacy, but there are lots of possible ways to design algorithms that are differentially private. And I think in a lot of cases people get those two ideas conflated, that there's only one way to do differential privacy, and that's not true. There's lots of ways to do it. The second thing is that it is not an absolute guarantee against disclosure risk. So if someone knows something about you that's very, very specific, they could still get at your data. It's a relative guarantee against disclosure risk. So it's relative to what you knew in the past. I just wanted to go over that quickly. It's not what I do, and it's kind of technical, but just to get that out of the way. Now I want to switch into exactly how is it applied, because I actually think that helps people understand what this is going to mean for the census data that come out in a couple of years. So I have a toy example. So imagine you've taken a survey of 100 individuals and you've asked them 2 questions. You've asked them to identify their born as sex, which takes 2 possible responses, male or female. And you ask them a question about school attendance. And there's 3 possible responses to that question: that they'd never attended school, that they're currently attending school, and that they attended school in the past. So we have a 2-variable question and a 3-variable question. We take those 100 responses and we construct a cross-tabulation, a 6-cell cross-tab from that true data. Here you can see that cross-tab. So we have 3 males who have never attended school, 4 females that have never attended school, and the population of this in this survey is 100. Now, to implement differential privacy, you essentially, for each cell in that table, you draw a random value from a Laplace or a geometric distribution. And the key thing to know here is that the spread of that distribution determines the amount of the maximal amount of noise that can be infused into the data. So the broader that spread is, the higher the chances, or you might draw a large value, either negative or positive, out of that distribution, which is then going to infuse a lot or a little amount of noise. So I've drawn 6 random values out of this particular spread, and the spread is determined by that epsilon parameter. I then add that noise to each cell in the cross-tabulation. So for male never attending, we subtract 1, and we get 2. For female never attending, we've tripled the value. So in the true data, we had 4 responses. Now, after doing differential privacy, we have 12. Some of the other values stay the same. Male attending, it was a 0, so we have the same number. But interestingly, we now have an N of 108, not 100. So we have essentially added 8 extra respondents to the survey. But now when I publish this data, there's no longer a one-to-one relationship between the people that filled out the survey and the 108 responses. So now you've protected the privacy of those 100 people, but at the cost of giving up on accuracy. So now we have tripled the number of females who are never attending. If you're going to design a policy intervention around that, you may say, hey, we need to reach out to that particular subpopulation, but in reality, maybe you really don't. And so the trade-off for privacy is accuracy. That's the lever that we're going to be talking about. So you could publish this data table, and it's differentially private. What the Census Bureau's software does is it actually constructs synthetic microdata, synthetic individual data from that cross-tabulation, and that's what is then fed into the Census Bureau's tabulation software that they use to create Summary File 1, Summary File 2, and all those products that we're used to dealing with. Okay, so there is, in 7 minutes, the most basic introduction that I can give to this idea of differential privacy. Now let's talk about those policy decisions that I think are incredibly important to think about, and I think this is where the Census Bureau's communications plan has been lacking, and this is where I think we at the IPPMS and the Minnesota Population Center have tried to demystify what differential privacy is and lay out some of these policy decisions that have to be made. So there's really 4 policy decisions that the Census Bureau is going to have to make, and these are made by people, right? They're not going to run a computer software system that says, hey, what's the optimal value of epsilon, and what's the optimal way to spread these out? There's going to be people sitting in a room in a committee chaired by Ron Jarman, the COO of the Census Bureau, and they're going to decide all of these pieces of information. 1, they're going to choose the global privacy loss budget. They're going to decide if it's going to be 0.1 or if it's going to be 10. That committee is going to make that decision. 2, they have to decide how to allocate the privacy loss budget to different levels of geography. So they have to decide, is the census tract the most important unit of analysis? Is the county? How do they actually subdivide that privacy loss budget up? They're going to make that decision. 3, they're going to decide which data tables deserve the most privacy protection. So when I talk about privacy protection, that means that it's either going to be more accurate or less accurate. There'll be more noise infused or less noise infused. So for example, the one major statutory part of the census is redistricting. And that table is a voting age by Hispanic by race table. And that table will probably be quite accurate because those numbers are very important for delineating districts. But if that table is more accurate, some other table is going to be less accurate because that privacy loss budget is fixed. There is a pool of privacy loss budget that they have to spend, and unless they make a policy decision later to increase that budget, when it's gone, it's gone. There is no more thing they can do to publish new data or make any changes. And the final thing they have to decide on is what are the invariants or the constraints. So an invariant is a count that does not have any noise infused within it. In 2010, invariants include total population and number of housing units at the census block level. So a census block has about 80 people in it, about 20 households. The counts that we got in 2010 for those had no noise infused within them. In 2020, the only invariant that we know of as of right now is the total population count at the state level, because that's what's used to apportion congressional districts. So we've gone from invariants at the block level to an invariant at the state level. And the types of constraints they have to decide upon, and this is my favorite thing to talk about, is that negativity. Right? So in differential privacy, you could actually generate counts that are negative, right? You're drawing values out of a distribution that is symmetrical around some value of 0. Do they want to publish negative numbers? I think that's kind of a bad idea. But when they don't publish negative numbers, they have positive upward bias in some of their other statistics. And how do you kind of negotiate that trade-off? So let's talk about the policy decisions that were made for some 1940 data, and that's what I'm going to leap off into my analysis of what I've done to look at the impacts that differential privacy has on output data. So in 1940, and that's the data that we're using for analysis, they have 4 geographic levels. They have nation, state, county, and they have an enumeration district. That's the smallest geographic unit that we have data for in 1940. There's about 800 people on average in an ED in the US. And they had 3 data tables. They had a voting age by Hispanic by race table. That's a 2 by 2 by 6 table, so 24 total cells. They had a household group quarters table that had 8 cells. So are you in a household? Are you in a college dormitory? Are you in a prison? Are you in a mental institution? Those are the types of group quarters we're talking about. And then they have what they call their detailed table. And that's the fully saturated histogram of all possible variables that go into their differential privacy software. So in this case, we have a 2 by 2 by 6 by 8, so 192 possible cells. So what they do is they assign fractions to all of these pieces, and they put it into this software system that does a bunch of linear optimization, and they create data that then kind of encodes all of the relationships that were measured and has noise infused within it based on certain privacy loss budgets. So now let's talk about what the results look like, because I think that's the most important thing to think about. I gave this talk twice yesterday, and they were an hour each. So like 20 minutes is like, I'm going to keep hammering away here. So the Census Bureau published their source code in April of 2019. And so it's all Python based, and we downloaded it and set up our own Amazon instance so that we could run the software ourselves and modify the parameters that we could to see how modifications impacted the accuracy of the output data. And it implements their top-down algorithm, which works for person-level tables, so age, anything that's a person-level variable, age, race, Hispanic ethnicity, or household counts, like how many households are there in a particular geographic unit. They currently cannot create any tables that say join persons to households, so they can't create differentially private versions of the number of children who are in a house that has a single female head. There's no way for them currently using their algorithm to generate that data table. So the way the system works is we have our 1940 full count data. That's the true data set, as true as a data set can be, but that's our gold standard that we're comparing against. We feed that through their disclosure avoidance system, or DAS, and the output of that program is differentially private 1940 microdata. The fixed parameters are the geographic levels I mentioned before, and the tables that we have. Modifiable parameters include the epsilon, the global privacy loss budget, the fractional allocations to these information, and then the number of times you run the system. Because it's random, you could run the system a ton of times to see what the distribution looks like. We're comparing true data and differentially private data among 5 dimensions. I'm not going to talk about all of these for everything that we've done, but we're looking at differences in total population for counties and enumeration districts, county level African American populations, the enumeration district level proportion of total population who identify as African American, and then 2 segregation indices, D and H, the index of dissimilarity and multigroup entropy. The key takeaways: geographic units with smaller populations are less accurate. small subpopulations, like the types of things we heard about this morning, will be less accurate. And there's some bias that we see in the segregation metrics that are concerning. This is all work I did on Monday, and so I don't quite have the interpretation down yet, but you'll see in the plots there's a bias that is an issue. So for the census data that they published data where they varied that global privacy loss budget from 0.25 up to 8. So 8 is very little noise, 0.25 is a lot of noise, and they ran it 4 times for each of those epsilons, giving us 32 possible data files. I'm only going to look at one run. It doesn't matter if you do run 1, 2, 3, or 4. They all look essentially the same. They assigned equal fractions to the geographic levels, so 25% to each of them. And they assigned on the voting age Hispanic race the largest fraction. That means the least amount of noise will be infused into that table. And the detailed table has a 0.1 of the privacy loss budget, so it gets a very small amount, so there's going to be the most noise infused into that table. So this is what just the raw differences are. So the orange box plots are the differences at the county level. The teal box plots are the differences at the ED level, and this is good in that this shows you that the software is working as it should. So the more epsilon you have, the less noise gets infused. The box plots shrink down. There's a lot more there's less noise being infused. So the output counts are closer to true than not. This is the African American population under different levels of noise injection. So in the upper left corner, that's at 0.25. This is a log-log scale. So you can see that for those small counts, so on the x-axis is true, that's the IPMs, the true count. The y-axis is the Census Bureau's differentially private data. And as you can see, we have situations where the IPMs data has 0 African Americans for a county, and the differentially private data is producing between 100 and 500 people who are African American in that county. As you move up to 8, of course, there's less noise being infused. The results tend to look a lot nicer. This is the percentage of the population who is African American for EDs. Kind of a similar story. Lots of noise getting infused at 0.25. There is a general spread tendency there, but there's a lot of spread around that identity line. At 8, it doesn't look so bad. This is the index of dissimilarity for the same data set. This is where you start to see that bias pop up. See how there's more dots to the lower right side of the data set. This means that the differentially private data is showing less segregation than is actually observed in the true data. And then anything to the left of the line is that segregation is worse than the true data are. And you see that in both D and 4-group multi-group entropy statistic. And I haven't quite worked out I think that has to do with this non-negativity constraint that's causing some of the bias to come up, but I haven't thought through that completely. So now I'm going to talk about what happens when we change the fractional allocation to geographic levels. So now I've set a global privacy loss budget of 1. I've done 1 run. And now I've run the system 4 times, and I assign each geographic level, I assign nation 0.85 of the privacy loss budget, and then everything else gets 0.05. I run it again, and I assign county 0.85, and for each of those geographic levels. I keep the same fraction of the allocation that the census used at the table level. And now we see some of the same plots. So at the county level, when we've assigned all the privacy loss budget to county, you see that red box, that orange box plot is really nicely clustered around 0 because we're injecting less noise into the county level count. But at the ED level, when you assign the most to ED, you get a really good spread there, but you give up accuracy in the other geographic levels. So this gets at that trade-off. How do you decide which of these geography levels is important? Because if you do make decisions, you are going to penalize or improve the data that come out of the system. This is the African American population at the geo level. This is the county population counts. The pattern's fairly similar. This is at the ED level. You can see when you give the ED level a lot of very little noise infusion, the results look pretty good. But the other geographic levels, you get a lot of variation in there in the ED proportions. This is the index of dissimilarity. Again, we see this positive upward bias. So a lot of the orange dots are to the left of that identity line for nation, state, and county. And then at the ED level, it shifts. There's more county dots to the lower right side of that line, and I haven't quite thought through that yet. The final thing we can do is assign the privacy loss budget to the tables in different ways. So privacy loss budget of 1, equal split of the fractions to geographic levels, but now I assign 0.9 of the privacy loss budget to each table. So voting age, household group quarters, or detailed. The household group quarters table works the best for total population. That's because it's a very small table. There's only 8 cells, so you just don't have the chance of drawing a large number from that random distribution. That's great for total population, but it does not work well when you add race into the table, into the situation. Race is not protected. There's a lot of noise infused into the race variable when you assign a lot of privacy loss budget to the household group quarters table. So now you see a lot more spread in that household group quarters when we look at the African American population at the county level. And it's even worse when we drill down to the ED level. When you assign the privacy loss budget to HHGQ, all bets are off kind of what kind of relationship you're going to get. But it looks pretty good for the ones that include race in it, voting age and EDs. My time is up. I'm going to skip through these last slides because the story's the same. You see a similar story every time. You allocate privacy loss budget to something, something has to give. There's that trade-off. So in conclusion, it's not as complicated as the math, I think, makes it out to be. It's noise injection. There's a privacy loss budget that controls the spread. If you kind of understand that, you're getting most of the way towards understanding what differential privacy is. These policy decisions play a key role in what's going on. So I've talked to Yvette's group, NCAI, a lot about what can NCAI do to advocate for the American Indian needs, but those will have to then kind of be considered by this policy group against the needs and desires of other groups that are advocating for these types of accurate data. The largest impact will be on these small areas and small subpopulations, which I think is a real key issue for people in this room today. There's Indian tribes that have very small counts in them, even at the nation level. This runs the risk of statistically erasing them from the data. And what does that mean from an equity perspective if you're erasing subpopulations? And finally, the bias in those segregation metrics makes me nervous. I don't quite know why yet, but I don't like to see that, and I'm trying to think through what that's going to mean going forward. So, and these slides I can make available for some of these references if people want more. So.
Do you have slides or?
I believe so.
Okay.
But I also have come prepared.
Okay. Oh, here you are. There's your clip.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Ravi Aran. I'm a colleague of Emilia, actually neighbor next room. Thank you for having me here. David proved his true academic credentials by sending me his material on Tuesday evening, and I out-academized him by sending mine to Anna at 2 a.m. this morning, in spite of which she somehow got it here. Quick background. There was a very famous mathematical paper that said, fundamental law of information recovery and protection, without injecting noise, you cannot protect privacy. We'll start with that. The only question is, how do we inject noise? So basically, privacy threats are threefold. Re-identify de-identified data, link two sets of independent records to glean some information about somebody that ought not to be known, finally, differencing attacks. So somehow if I know that there is a database of 99 people in a rural county in Minnesota, and another database of 100 people, and I know that the person of interest that I have, somebody who is running for public office, is going to happen to be there at the 100th location. And I want to find something really interesting about this person. I can run a query first, asking me some aggregate data about the 99, and then run another query asking aggregate data about the 100, and the difference in the two will tell me what that 100th person is. So this is known as differencing. And differencing need not be just by a measure of one. You can do it combinatorially. The example that David had 4 parameters, nation, county. Combinatorially, that's 2 raised to 4 minus 1, 15 possibilities. And roughly, if I run about 1,500,000 queries, I can actually pinpoint and pull out an individual from rural Minnesota and say, oh yeah, you are actually suffering from type 2 diabetes, and twice you had your prescription for opioids turned down. It is as dismal as it sounds. Actually, let me say something more cheerful. It's even more dismal than it sounds. You will see why. So the question is, how do we inject that noise? And there are multiple options. David chose the most parsimonious option, which is the Laplace distribution. You can also try the Gaussian distribution, but all of those other distributions have one drawback. If I know that you have used those, because of their symmetry, it gives me hope. I will run millions of queries hoping that central limit theorem will kick in, and those queries sort of cancel out each other symmetrically, and I'm sort of getting at interesting information about Chairman Gates. To go back to the Bill Gates example that he used. So Laplace doesn't have that symmetry, so injecting noise from Laplace distribution is the best way to keep out all those malicious attacks. Okay. First, it's not absolute privacy. What differential privacy gives you, the sort of gold standard is this. If you chose to opt out of a survey, ideally, I want to give you the same privacy as when you chose not to opt out and have your data. In expectation, probabilistically, can I give you the same privacy that you would have if you did not answer a survey question? This is what DP is all about, okay? The privacy loss parameter, I won't go into the math of this. I want you to think about, because this is what really I want to talk about. After injecting the noise, what can you do? Take the example that David gave of taking a privacy loss budget of 1, epsilon value equals 1, 0.85 for the top level domain, and 0.05 for the next 3 domains. The smaller that number gets to be, the greater the amount of noise you're injecting, the more your accuracy gets spoiled, your accuracy gets less and less reliable, but the more privacy I as an individual will get. At 0.05, there is a pernicious mathematical lower limit that says you need to have at least 1 divided by 0.05 records of that subcategory. Otherwise, all your parametric analysis are useless. So if you have an some epsilon value, the minimal data set at the lowest level of microdata has to be at least 1 by epsilon. So if you have 0.05 as your microdata segmentation, you need to have at least 20 records there before I can start injecting noise. Otherwise, the whole thing is lost. Now, given that limitation, and given that we want meaningful information, what kinds of, after injecting the noise and giving the ideal level of protection, what kind of analysis can we do? Histograms will survive. Most frequency counts will survive. They are known as agnostic counts. You can sort of assume that they're evenly distributed. They're not going to be spoiled. Anything where you run a query saying, count something based on this variable, number of people of South Asian descent in Silicon Valley who have got the thrifty gene and heart condition. Folks like me of South Asian descent in Silicon Valley who may have a heart condition, if you run a query like that, it says, count on a variable, specify a condition and a table. Generally, those are robust. Now, here is why I said the answer is a little dismal. Now, think of the same query not being run on Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, South Asian descent happens to be about 95% of Silicon Valley. But think of running this in rural Minnesota. If you have 10 people in rural Minnesota from Sri Lanka, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the moment you have an epsilon of 0.05, that's useless because 1 by 0.05 is 20. So the maximum that you can have is 0.1. So 1 by 0.1 is 10. But as that epsilon value starts going higher and higher, a malicious attacker, I'm sort of licking my lips in appreciation saying, very few South Asians, you can't do much noise. I'm going to get everything I want out of this. So that's the problem with this. Linear regression, it creates what are known as torsions in most structural estimation models. The greater problem is some weak and interesting correlations of infrequently found people can be washed out. If you discover, for instance, Cambodians in California, the children are disproportionately prone to pigmentation of eye, the corneal pigmentation. If you don't have enough of those records, this noise can completely kill it and will tell you at 99% confidence interval, Cambodians have the same propensity to, children have the same propensity to have corneal pigmentation as the general population. That's a problem. You can have a lot of privacy, you'll get pseudo results. You can have very good results, but you'll get very little privacy. The problem is acute for rare populations and rare microdata groups. Finally, you come to machine learning. It's a big challenge for machine learning models because the problem is machine learning models are correlation engines. If you think of a tree-like data, you're trying to study in the rural Midwest areas which lost their jobs to China, is education a barrier against loss of income? If you have a tree-like structure that says, okay, rural Midwest, yes, no, branch, okay? Mostly manufacturing, yes or no, branch. Job automated, yes or no, branch. Non-automated jobs went to China, traded, yes or no, branch. Manufacturing facility shut down, yes or no, branch. Highly educated, moderately educated, low education, 3 different branches. Now you reach the leaves and look at their incomes. If you don't inject noise, it's a pretty good chance that I can write machine learning algorithms. Deep learning is the one that's most often in the news, but I can also write things like support vector machines. I could also write algorithms such as regression forests, random tree regressions, etc., to predict pretty carefully what's going to happen to those populations. But if you start injecting noise, you can create new tree structures, new limbs, and new branches, and completely defeat the ability of machine learning to come up with prediction. Explanatory models, the top 4 are explanatory models, right up to clustering. Machine learning is a prediction model. It's a black box that gives you prediction. Where noise injection makes you suffer most is with prediction model. Some of the most useful prediction models will be lost. And that's where the smaller the epsilon, the more you can protect the privacy, but you'll almost surely kill my ability to make rare prediction. The higher the epsilon, the better my prediction engine will work, but somebody armed with a computer and lots of Python codes will get through and break through the privacy. So that's the trade-off. That's the real trade-off. So accuracy, David spoke at length about it. Is negative 20 seconds left? Okay. So at some point in time when you want me to stop, just throw something at me and I'll get the idea. Truthfulness is another very important metric of all statistical analysis. Truthfulness is, before injections, if I can make some statements about a population data sample, after injecting the noise, can I make those same statements? That's the truthfulness criterion. So if I ask the question, number of South Asians that exercise 4 times a week and have coronary heart disease, if I can say something before injecting the noise, can I say the same thing after injecting the noise? The answer to that is yes, if you're generally making a statement about South Asian. But if you're making a statement about South Asians that live in Minneapolis, that exercise 4 times a week and have coronary heart disease, maybe not. As you start increasing the dimensionality of that microdata, the truthfulness will suffer. You can have lots of privacy, low truthfulness, or you can have lots of truthfulness and low privacy. So I'll stop on the cheerful note. Thank you.
Randy?
Hi, Randy Aki.
I had a question about the negative aspect. So thank you again, Ravi. That was really helpful too. But the question is that your example didn't have any negative values, but you could have had.
Right, you could have, yeah. So right now, the software code that Census has released has a non-negativity constraint built into it. So they actually will not, they do it in some kind of adjustment where they reset anything that's negative to 0. Then they have to figure out what to do with the rest, with those excess non-persons. They have to adjust for that, and that's just one of these constraints they've put into place. Yvette?
Thank you for that presentation. You know, we've been working on this since March. And, you know, I learn more every presentation I see and every discussion that we have. It's an extremely complex issue. I'm not sure I understand what the Census Bureau is now saying is they're going to implement differential privacy to the place level, and then they're going to develop a new methodology for data below that level. And can you give your interpretation of what that might mean for small, and what their implications for small populations, and what recommendations we should be thinking about?
So I don't know how they can do that necessarily, because the way that differential privacy is supposed to work is it's a one-shot deal. So before you create the output data, you set up the table allocation, you set up the geographic levels, you hit go on the computer system, and it makes a data set that comes out the other end. And that to do it for down to the place level for one set and then do something different runs into the possibility for differencing attacks. So you have one data set from one algorithm and another data set from something else. If I'm a good, sophisticated data user, I could difference those. So when you mention that, that's the first time I've heard that. The one thing that's been tricky with this is it's like hitting a moving target. So every time Census talks about this, you're getting a little bit more information, and we don't really know as data users, we don't know kind of what's going to happen. You know, I went to Copenhagen this summer, and I woke up one morning and they had said that they're pushing out the implementation of ACS till 2025, and I was like, that's awesome, but like, why? Like, what went into that discussion? And I know it's the dimensionality piece. They just don't know how to do it, but we just don't have full information at this point in time to know what to do.
So I actually have a question to both David and Ravi. I'm interested in this point that Ravi made about the big data algorithms and how that could be helpful or not helpful, and how all of this DP affects the big data. Since we seem to be moving in that direction and exporting a lot of the analysis and crunching numbers to machines, is that something that the Census is thinking about at all, or is this something that we should be bringing up as, you know, that's where we're going?
Right.
This is a big problem, according to what Ravi said.
I mean, I think Census is trying to, what they're scared of is someone doing exactly that, where they'll take the data that come out of the census and you'll, you know, deconstruct it, and then you'll dump it into a big computer with a bunch of other data and be able to re-identify individuals in the output data. That's exactly the reason they're going towards differential privacy, because it provides protections against that particular attack on the data. But again, that privileges the privacy protection over the accuracy. And for a lot of small subpopulations like the ones that were talked about this morning, decennial is the only data product we have that provides reliable counts for these individuals. So, you know, that balancing act is really hard to do, and I think data users need to be aware of what could happen. But they're trying to protect against exactly the thing you're talking about.
Well, I meant it more as, you know, I might just want to do this because I don't really know where to look for a problem, but
Right.
I have some idea that people whose jobs got exported to Chan, and then I'll find it if I don't have the DP, but I won't find it if I, yeah.
And I think it goes into, you know, some of those correlations, right? So that when you privilege certain data tables, when certain data tables get noise injected or don't get noise injected, you're kind of enforcing those correlations into the data, and that's going to be a issue.
Smaller actually amplify the inaccuracy by doing exactly this, by forcing correlation into some levels and not putting correlations into other levels. So if I want to make a prediction about, let's say, what is the amount that healthcare spending of people, rural hemophiliac patients over the age of 65, you would destroy the predictability of that by privileging certain data sets with higher noise and giving lower noise other data sets.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, great. Thank you. One more? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yep.
The DP is to be applied to the census, decennial census, or will it also apply to the American Community Survey and other surveys that the Census Bureau collects?
So the current plan is that it will first be implemented for the decennial 2020 census, and then they are doing research, and they will not apply differential privacy until the 2025 American Community Survey data come out. But I would guess that in the long run, the plan would be for differential privacy to be used for all federal statistical data products that are published. So the current population survey, the National Health Interview Survey, everything that is currently out, I would guess that to do it right, they would want it to apply to all federal data products. And so I think that's the thing we have to stay on top of, is what does that look like for all other federal products that are out there.
Sorry, just a quick clarification. So would that be for what is for public use, but would restricted files still be unperturbed?
Correct. So so that would be for public use. The restricted access would be unperturbed. And a lot of computer scientists want restricted access modality, like in the way that health data are accessed, right? Restricted access modalities are very common, but if you hear the census talk, they want these restricted access modalities to be commonplace. So they want to have, these thin clients, and that's a hard scalability problem, right? How do you scale up the research data centers and restricted access for all these communities?
However, this is Randy. In our discussions, however, say you use data at the research data centers, sort of behind the firewall, and you wanted to publish something in the future, part of this epsilon will be allocated to researchers there. So when that research budget is used up, so 5 people before you got in, you can no longer publish using that data, the private use data. So it's fixed. Just as he was saying, it is a finite resource that's going to be made available for public use tables, but there's a subgroup for special researchers that get some allocation of that budget, who can go in, use confidential use data, get Census Bureau clearance, kind of like what Amelia and I did prior to all of this with the stuff that you saw. But in the future, that's going to be rationed. And so that's another issue. That's completely separate from what he was just speaking.
And there's no policy in place yet from Census for how that's going to get allocated. And not only that, but internal Census Bureau researchers have to use up the same budget. So all the substantive researchers at Census who do this work are part of the same pool. And so all these different data products, Census researchers, FSRDC researchers, public use researchers, all participate with the same budget. And how is that going to be allocated? What are the rules? I mean, is Raj Chetty going to get the most of the budget? I mean, how is that decision-making process going to be made? We don't know yet. So, thanks.
Sorry, next speaker is Hope Corman.
Which is yours? Corman, there we go.
There we go.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Well, first I want to thank Randy and Amelia for inviting my team, and I'm representing this entire team. Unfortunately, not all of my co-authors were on the program, so I want to acknowledge everybody and to show that this is joint research with people with 5 different people at multiple institutions. It really was a joint effort. And I do want to say my wheels are still spinning so much since the last presentation that even I'm having a hard time switching gears. And I do want to say also that our presentation is different than all the others because we're starting off with the policy first and then interested in the subpopulations, rather than most everybody else has been talking about data or populations first and then policy. So ours is a little bit different. And what I'm going to be talking about today is the effect of welfare reform on the next generation. And the next generation, we're looking at the teenage children of the mothers who were first affected by welfare reform. So we have so many people to thank for so much. I'm happy to share this slide with anybody who's interested, and I'm happy to share the paper with anybody who's interested. So let me just start off talking about welfare reform in the United States in a nutshell. And again, I could talk for hours and hours about this, but federal legislation in 1999 signed by President Clinton, but welfare reform actually started a few years earlier with state waivers to the welfare programs. So 1992 was actually the first state that implemented a substantial welfare reform program. And the goal of welfare reform, and it is still today, was to promote work, encourage marriage, and reduce non-marital child bearing. The program was not to help needy, was not to provide financial assistance or to provide assistance. That wasn't the primary goal or even the secondary goal of welfare reform. And the idea behind it was that this would break this culture of dependence and disrupt the intergenerational transmission of poverty and dependence. And the idea also has been stated by some is that these families were marginalized before, and this would bring them into the mainstream. So these are all, I think, very nice ideas. The key features of welfare reform, the PRWORA is the actual name of the legislation. Well, I'll let you read the actual words. It's the personal responsibility and work, blah, 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 whatever the rest of it is. Okay. But the program was aimed toward women because women were mostly the welfare recipients, women with children, and work requirements, sanctions for non-compliance, meaning if you didn't try to work, sanctions for if you had a drug conviction, restrictions for teen mothers if you were underage and you had a child in order to stay on welfare, in order to receive welfare for yourself and your child, you had to stay with either a parent or another responsible adult and stay in school. Time limits of up to 5 years according to the federal legislation, but it could be fewer years in individual states. And family caps, meaning if you had another child while you were on welfare, you didn't get any extra money. So there's been quite a literature on the effect of welfare reform on mothers. There were definitely huge decreases in caseloads. Work that my team has done found decreases in crime and decreases in substance use, increases in employment. There's quite a range of what people have found with that. Some work that my group did looked at increases in civic participation. We looked at voting. But for the two areas that welfare reform was supposed to also impact, which was on marriage and on fertility, the studies that have been done didn't seem to find much effects there. So the purpose of our research is what about the next generation? And there really have not been a lot of studies that have looked at adolescents, and very few studies have looked at separately at the effects for boys versus for girls. And we were particularly interested to study teens, partly because they're kind of the first group forward. The younger kids are still moving along. So they're soon to become adults. So to get an idea of what they're going to do as adults, we look at what they do as teens. They have more autonomy in their decision making, and they can speak for themselves, which was something that we wanted to look at rather than having their mothers report on what they were doing, particularly for some sensitive areas like drug use. We thought we'd go with what the kids said. If any of you have teenage children, they're probably not giving you the most accurate information on what they're doing. So we thought that. They're just talking, I don't know, about the previous literature on the next generation. There was quite a bit of literature on high school completion and fertility, and just about all of that was only geared toward girls, since welfare, the idea is that people thought, well, welfare reform affected women, so it would affect their daughters, so we're not going to look at the boys because it wasn't geared toward boys, it was geared toward females. So the research did find lower rates of high school dropout and lower rates of teen fertility. And another group of research looked at actual experiments that were generally very geographically isolated in nature, where before the actual federal legislation, there were community and state experiments on what if we did this versus this, and they were really more controlled to some extent, but not blind experiments. And most of these studies also did not look at teens and did not look at gender. So for the one group of studies that did look at teens and gender, most things were found insignificant. But again, these were based on experiments mostly in communities with the sample size less than 1,000. And they were geographically isolated. They're just one community in one state. Our previous research did differentially look at boys and girls. We used aggregate uniform crime report statistics on arrests for teenagers, for males and females, and we found a possible increase in drug arrests for both males and females, and no effect on arrests for serious crimes, but possibly some effect in minor crimes, a decrease for both males and females. So that's kind of the previous research in, as far as we know. If anybody knows of any other research that we missed, please let us know. Just looking at what we would expect the effects to be, we would expect there would be a pro-social effect. I mean, first of all, look at how the previous literature showed that the mothers, they worked more, they voted more, they used less drugs, they did less crime. It seemed like if it was a very socially positive thing for the mothers, well, wouldn't that kind of be passed on to the children? And that's the increased maternal modeling of these mainstream behaviors and a change in the normative climate against this culture of dependence. And the increased household income may also have a positive impact on the kids. But I'm an economist, so on one hand, now I'm talking the other hand, there could be a decrease in the amount of income or an increase in the monetary constraints, an increase in time constraints. Sometimes increased income can cause kids to use more substances because there's more money available. It's not always that more income means less substance use. And possible reduced supervision. And there's good reason to think that there would be differential effects by gender, and we're really pleased to have a developmental psychologist as part of this team to help us kind of conceptualize this a little bit, that disruptive events have more adverse effect on boys than girls. This has been found. Teen boys, and as you'll see in a few slides, are more likely to engage in antisocial behavior to begin with. Girls might be more called upon to take care of younger siblings. Girls are going to be directly affected by welfare, more directly affected by welfare as they get older. So if they do more good things, it might help them, and if they do more bad things, it might hurt them. The girls might be more subject to their mother's modeling than the boys would be. So just to reiterate, welfare reform was rolled out between 1992 and 1996 in state welfare waiver programs, and then the federal legislation was in 1996, and by early 1998, welfare reform had been implemented in all 50 states. So to look at this, we used two data sets. The first data set is monitoring the future, which is a repeated cross-section of 10th and 12th graders. We looked at teens, so 10th and 12th graders. 1991 was the first year they had the younger group, so that's our starting point. And we stopped at 2006 because we didn't want the Great Recession to be conflated with this, and we had enough post-reform years at least to get a first look at this. And we limited our results to minors. I think in the paper we talk about the fact that we expanded it. And we used an auxiliary data set, one that we had hoped would be our primary data set, but it didn't work out that way, which was the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, Child, and Young Adult Supplement. We also looked at children 15 to 17. The design of that one worked out to be a little more of a problem for us because they really changed the design in 1994. So it gave us less to work with. Plus, I mean, longitudinal data sets can be so great, but you're always limited more in sample size. So it's a trade-off. So I won't bore you with this, but for those of you who are interested, we use a triple difference model to look at this difference and difference and differences. I'm happy to go over the modeling with anybody later on. And I'm sure Valentina will tell you, we did a lot of robustness checks in the paper. So to look at how valid our statistical approach was. And just to give you a sense of where these kids were before welfare reform, most of our variables, they asked them for the monitoring the future, they asked them of the kids while they were in school, so their parents weren't around at all. If they used marijuana, alcohol, cigarettes, or other illicit drugs, where other illicit drugs are what you might call hard drugs. And this is in an era before the opioid epidemic and before e-cigarettes. So we're a little earlier. And when you use a difference model like we did, our target group is kids that we thought would be possibly subject to welfare reform, having single mothers with a high school education or less. And then our comparison group are kids who would be potentially similar, but have married mothers who would not be eligible for welfare reform. And if you look across this, first of all, again, you can see that most teens use some substance, and that are comparing our target group to our control group. They're pretty similar in terms of substance use. What we do find is, except for cigarettes and hard drugs or other illicit drugs, the boys use more than the girls, but our groups aren't that different from each other. We also looked at a range of antisocial behaviors: skipping school, damaging property, fighting, stealing, and hurting somebody in the past year. And Here you see that although there isn't a huge difference between the target and control groups, again, that boys, except for skipping school, which seems to happen to both genders, the boys are more likely to engage in these antisocial behaviors than the girls are. So this is really what our main results are for our substance use. So if, I guess this thing, oh well. What you want to see is that top number and the stars. The stars indicate statistical significance. So the welfare reform, just to give you, increased because of welfare reform and being in the target group, these boys were about 3.2 percentage points more likely to use marijuana after welfare reform, just as a very simple way to interpret these. And you'll see that the effects for marijuana are a little higher for boys. The kids drank, it didn't affect alcohol use. It affected smoking a little more for girls. And I think the most consequential thing in this slide is the fact that it definitely had a positive effect of 1.9 percentage points for boys using hard drugs, which is the most consequential one, and no effect for girls. Looking at these antisocial behaviors, there's even more stark differences between the boys and the girls. Skipping school wasn't that different between the two, but the boys were much more likely to damage property and get into fights that involved hurting somebody than were the girls. We also kind of did what we call a cross-equation estimation, summarizing everything together. And again, you'll see that if you just look at the stars here, right at the crosshatches, the boys were about 8, this is 0.08 standard deviations more likely to engage in antisocial behaviors because of welfare reform, no effect on girls. The boys were about 5.7 about 0.057 standard deviations more likely to use substances, and the girls were about 0.042. So substance use was stronger for boys than girls, and antisocial behaviors was only the boys. Okay, I actually, we did, I actually had a graph too, and the paper has a graph that puts it all together, and you see that it's really dramatic, that if you kind of lump all of these things together, it had an increase in these negative behaviors for boys and much muted effect for girls. And when we tried combining everybody, particularly, we started off with the NLSY, we got inconsistent results. It was really hard. And we only was able to pinpoint these results once we disaggregated between the boys and the girls. So we looked at length of exposure. We looked at the NLSY as our alternative data set with a limited set of covariates, with a limited set of variables, but we were able to do a little bit more with that, including more specific modeling. We looked at some mediators. We didn't get a lot there, and we did many robustness checks. So the takeaway from all of this is that welfare reform definitely had adverse effects on the next generation, even if it had positive effects on the women who were directly affected. There were stronger cumulative effects for longer exposure, striking gender differences. And this is consistent with kind of a recent literature looking on gender gaps and disadvantage. And it just shows how important it is to look at the effect of these really important and still the welfare reform and the welfare policies are still in effect today, And to only look at females would really be missing the full picture. So I'm now almost a tenth of a standard deviation beyond, so I'll say thank you, everybody, and we would really appreciate comments, and if anybody knows of any literature we missed, please let us know.
Well, hello, I'm Valentina Duque, and I was very happy to accept to come here. I'm at Sydney, at the University of Sydney, to come and to discuss this great paper, which I found fascinating. So let me do a very brief summary of what the authors did. They investigated the effects of the 1996 welfare reform on children's adolescents' outcomes, delinquent behavior, and substance use, and they were particularly interested in examining differences by child sex. So they did a very thorough research, literature review, what has previous studies have analyzed, and very little has been said about adolescents' outcomes, and in particular boys. So this paper helps to close that gap in the literature. Using two quasi-experimental methods, triple difference model, as well as a mother fixed effects model, the authors found that children born to low-income mothers and married mothers who were differentially exposed to the shock, to the policy change, experienced increases in delinquent behaviors, which were mostly concentrated on boys, and substance use for boys and girls, more pronounced effects for boys. And these effects in their event time study analysis, which Hope didn't have time to show, but in the paper they do show that these responses tend to be occur salient after 2 to 3 years post welfare reform implementation. Okay, so the paper is super strong from the causal inference perspective. It was very hard for me to find weaknesses or places to provide constructive comments. The paper is bulletproof in that sense. There's lots of robustness checks and analysis of potential sources of selection bias. So my comments now are going to focus on trying to explain or pick or trying to disentangle or propose what are the mechanisms behind these effects that the authors find. So, and also to say a little bit about endogenous migration and the persistence of the effects and some policy implications derived from the results. So the potential mechanisms that the authors mention in the paper have to do with employment effects. Mothers being forced to find some formal, well, not formal, but an employment. And obviously, the changes that come with employment, income in particular, and changes regarding child supervision, because as mothers are now working, they are less at home taking care of the children. And obviously, another substantial change or potential mechanism was this change in culture. That is more difficult to test, but it's also a strong pathway through which the welfare reform could have affected the next generation. So the way how they analyze these potential mechanisms is through a mediation exercise where they try to account in their main data set and main analysis specification for these potential pathways. The authors do not show what are the coefficients accompanying these income changes or employment participation of women, so we don't know exactly the sign or magnitude of these effects. However, they do talk about how the main effect on children's outcomes change due to accounting for these potential mediators. And they find that around 1/5 of the effect can be explained by the mediators. So while reading the paper, some ideas came to my mind about other potential mechanisms. And on the one hand, I think income itself plays a major role. In the introduction, the paper discusses that actually the effects on income are not well understood, because there are two competing forces. On the one hand, women are transitioning to work, right? So they are earning more in labor income, but on the other hand, welfare income is declining. So it wasn't clear to me from the discussion in the paper what is the net overall effect on income. So this clearly invites to further explore income and mother supply as a potential mechanism. What is going there? What is going on? The second potential mechanism that I think is relevant has to do with mothers' physical and mental health. So previous studies about the welfare reform, like Marianne Bittler's paper and co-authors in 2004, had found little effect on women's health from the reform. However, more recent studies, and one also by Marianne Bittler, have started to found some significant changes in women's physical health and also mental health. And in a recently published paper by Evans and Cartwright, they find some significant effects of changes in the expansions in the earned income tax credit on mothers' self-reported health and changes in biomarkers. So that invites to perhaps examine a mother's physical health and mental health, but also changes in stress, perhaps associated with the fact that they now have to keep a job, find a job, because they don't have the welfare cushion. So another potential mechanism that perhaps could operate, and because they found so strong effects on boys, is the role of fathers. And so boys raised without a biological father at home receive fewer inputs, emotional support compared to girls. So I'm wondering in the Analyses why, because it's a panel study and it allows you to look into more richer measures of the home environment, whether you could look at if the welfare reform had some differential changes in the child-father relationship. I don't know. Okay, the second point that I wanted to bring is endogenous migration. So in the main analysis of the paper, the authors define treatment based on a mother's current state of residence. So this could potentially be an endogenous decision of where to live. However, in their NLSY analysis, where they use the panel structure, they find somewhat similar coefficients. So perhaps the endogenous mobility is not a major concern, but since you have the NLSY, you could actually test for these changes. Regarding previous studies on the effects of the welfare reform on interstate migration, some papers have actually found some significant effects. And I was thinking that migration could also be a potential mechanism. So there is endogenous migration, like where if the welfare reform induced that differential change in migration by mothers' observable characteristics, but also because the reform forced women to find jobs And if the decision of where to find a job, etc., was associated with a migration for economic opportunities, could migration itself help explain these differential effects on boys versus girls? And it reminds me about the paper on the move to opportunity, right? So depending on the age at which children migrated, there were differential effects. So children who migrated in adolescence experienced more that was associated with a disruption in the social networks and some adverse effects in other dimensions. The third comment that I had to do with the persistence of the effects. So a question is, does timing matters? So you focus on adolescents, but adolescents who were adolescents by the time of the welfare reform. Now, could it be the case that children exposed to the welfare reform at a different stage were more or less likely to develop these behaviors later in life? So conditioning on the same outcome of interest, delinquent behavior and substance use, but if the exposure occurred at another critical stage, do we see similar effects, similar magnitudes, the same effects by boys and girls? The second point is duration into the program. Duration is an endogenous decision, so I was wondering whether you could use your research design to look, to try to instrument for duration into the program. And lastly, just to close, the mechanisms and the more heterogeneity into these mechanisms and persistent could actually offer valuable insights into policy implications from your results. And that's it. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, first, I want to thank Valentina for fabulous comments, and please send me your slides. You brought up so many interesting things, the one thing I want to answer from one of her questions is, one of the things that was interesting is when you looked at, well, what about employment? For most of these teenage children, their mothers were already working. So it didn't have a huge impact on going from being a non-participant to a participant. But I think the idea of having to maintain a consistent employment is a very different story, and it involves really getting into the weeds with the data that unfortunately we weren't able to do yet. And I do want to say that we are trying to look at younger children in the future as well, and looking at the teens as they transition to adulthood. And also, I want to say there's a very recent working paper that is able to looks at teenage kind of antisocial behavior and how that does seem to translate into more criminal behavior in adulthood. So our results for the boys in particular are particularly troubling. And I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you for the paper and the comments. If I understand correctly, you don't know whether they went into the welfare reform program. We just think that was the group who are most likely to be exposed to it.
Yes, this is what we would call an intent to treat analysis, rather than looking at the people who were currently on or who had been on welfare. So these are anybody who might have gone on welfare or who were on welfare.
Because there was an assumption throughout, I think, that these were women who'd responded to welfare reform by going into work or working more, but there were a number of women who responded to welfare reform by dropping out. You had 3 strikes or out if you didn't meet the conditions, and it seems to have deepened the divisions in some ways. The women who responded positively and the women who were unable or unwilling to respond, who became poorer. And so I'm just wondering, because of your research design, you can't tell whether it's the ones who
that's a great point, and that's something that we hope to look at going forward. It really, talk about disaggregated data. you know, it was really a trade-off. We wanted the kids' responses. The Monitoring the Future has very little information on the parents that NLSY does. But we want to look at those who are most likely to fall through the cracks versus those who are most likely to succeed. And we really strongly suspect that there were very heterogeneous effects depending on the woman's human capital to begin with, health and education.
Worry the results were being driven as much by the women who dropped out as by the women who did more work, and just don't know that
This
yet.
is just an average treatment effect, and
Right.
we would love to be able to disaggregate it further.
Yeah, so I just think it's really hard to know what the implications are until we know that.
Okay, sorry. Sort of following up on this, I think it could be helpful to just have a sense of what the first stage is. Like, what are the shares of women in your intended to treat group that would have traditionally participated in welfare prior to welfare reform and afterwards, just to ballpark these kinds of questions and to sort of scale the coefficients, unless you think, which is another question, that there's like a broader, that the impact of this could operate through some other mechanism than whether your mom is actually participating in these programs or not, that there could be some, other changes that happen like in the community or something like that. I don't know if you have that in mind.
I think that the stress might be for everybody, just knowing that the safety net is no longer there. But as far as being able to disaggregate it, I mean, we're getting back into the issue of data requirements and getting a data set that would really have a lot of information and information on the teens separately. The NLSY, we were really struggling a little bit. So, but it's something that we hope to do in the future, and we really that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, just it would be helpful, again, in the spirit of the theme of this conference, on like what you think would be good elements to collect in NLSY, and also just a quick comment that you should look at foreign versus U.S. foreign, because welfare reform really was this constriction of the 5-year bar, and then looking at gender identity, because that would be another point.
Hello and good afternoon. We are trudging along very bravely for this late in the afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Shabab Ahmed Mirza. I'm with the Center for American Progress, where I am a research assistant. I have absolutely no business being up here following these amazing scholars and researchers, so I thank Randy for inviting me over here and getting to talk about a piece that I did. I was a little surprised to see that I was classified under academic session. This was not an academic paper, and this probably will not be an academic presentation, so I apologize in advance. What I was looking at was disaggregating data for the LGBTQ community, specifically looking at sexual orientation. Now, I realize that for some folks, we're dealing with data sets where we don't collect sexual orientation information as it is. So I'm taking that a bit of a step further, where we say, suppose we have this data set where we're looking at LGBTQ people. Let's talk about how even within that group, right, the letters, the L, the G, the B, those things can be different. So let's understand the difference a little bit more. First of all, who are bisexual people? And so as similar to what some folks have said so far, it is a question of identity, right? I think other health surveys can sometimes look at sex of sexual contacts and how people behave, but we're really interested in is a community that identifies as such. So someone who is bisexual is someone who identifies as bisexual. Bi also does not equal to. Some people define it as attraction to one's own gender and to other genders. people have all sorts of definitions, and within our community that has an endlessly long acronym of letters. We try and be really supportive of that and make sure that all of those definitions can come to the table. One of my favorite descriptions of the sort of binary within bisexuals is you have your friends who are obsessed with podcasts and those who are obsessed with astrology, and you kind of have to deal with both, right? That's one of the few binaries we see for bisexual people. Within that, we have bisexual, queer, pansexual, and a whole host of other identities that indicate attraction to more than one gender. We did some survey analysis using a survey that CAP commissioned ourselves. We had about 1,800 respondents, and these were some of the findings we found from there. I'll try and breeze through the boring charts a little bit and get to our interesting parts in a second. One of the first things we looked at was whether people are working, and what we found is that bi plus women, and when we say bi plus, it's using that umbrella term to talk about people who identified as bisexual and queer, because both were options on our survey. That bi plus women were less likely to be working than lesbians. And when we look at what's been done in the field so far, some of the research that's been done is conflating all LBQ women. And so when we try and disaggregate bisexual orientation, we see these differences start to present themselves. Similarly, when we looked at caregiving, we found some differences as well. You'll notice that bi plus women are a lot more likely to be caregiving for minor children. And that tracks with what we know from prior surveys as well. What was also particularly interesting is when we try and think in these very binary terms, are bi plus people behaving like their straight peers, or are they behaving like their lesbian or gay peers, right? And while that may not be the correct question to ask, if we just sort of sit with that for a moment, you'll notice that when we look at the third factor of chosen family, we know that LGBTQ people broadly have really strong connections with chosen family. They'll often rely on those social networks for sources of support. What we also know is that chosen family, while it may seem like a relatively new concept, it's been in federal policy for decades, and about a third of Americans have reported that they have taken time off from work to care for a member of their chosen family. And if you'll sort of pardon the interactive element for a bit, to the extent that you feel comfortable, how many folks in the room have taken time off from work to care for chosen family? So that is someone who you would consider to be equivalent of family but isn't a blood relation. Can we get a show of hands? Yeah? All right then, maybe some of you will in the future. But what we do know is that it's when we did this survey, we were surprised to see that it is a remarkably common occurrence, but even so, we know that it is more common amongst the LGBTQ community, and this is one in which we found relatively few differences between bi plus respondents and lesbian and gay respondents. We also looked at health outcomes. There were a whole host of different healthcare factors. One that I'll focus on in particular is mental health. And what we do know, and this tracks with what we found in the past, is that bisexual and queer people report worse mental health outcomes than their monosexual counterparts. So what are these differences, and what can we say about them that are significant or not? As you can see, there are a lot of ways in which the way bi plus women are behaving in terms of their observable behavior is different from lesbians, where bi plus men are different from gay men. If I just sort of go back for a little bit, you'll notice that 2% of bi plus men reported that they were caregiving for an adult family friend or member, compared to 12% of gay men. This is one in which gay men are behaving similarly to women across sexual orientation. And all of this is on the internet. I'm not going to bore you with the details for now, but just coming back to this sort of global thing, we find that there are a bunch of different significant differences for bisexual people in particular compared to their monosexual counterparts. And I use the term monosexual because I think it's not often that we are used to grouping people who are gay and straight together, but that is exactly the purpose of this analysis, and we find that there are at least 5 meaningful differences. What does this mean in terms of how other things we know about their behavior? We know that they're more likely to use public benefits. There's been previous research on the propensity to use SNAP or food stamps, and that tracks in our current research as well. We know that bi plus folks experience poverty at higher rates as well. One of the findings that was most interesting to our reporters was that bi plus men are 4 times more likely to be living in poverty than straight men. And And if you remember the employment statistics, that 4-time difference was not there. So what are the other factors that are contributing to that is a question you may want to ask. We also wanted to look at discrimination in particular, because one of the things we know in terms of that whole social determinants of health model is that discrimination can play a really significant role. And what we found is that bi+ respondents actually reported lower rates of discrimination based on their sexual orientation than their lesbian or gay counterparts. Now, that is something that was really interesting, and we consulted with some experts who've been doing bisexual advocacy for years, and they pointed out a very interesting idea, which is that there are different kinds of stigma, right? One is the kind you can see. If you have a partner of a different gender, you might not be perceived as bisexual, so you might not have that unfair treatment that is so common for the LGBTQ community because your difference is not marked. However, because you are in this other category that's hidden, you might have feelings of shame or isolation, right? So that stigma does remain. And that might be one way to help understand how we're seeing this lower rate of discrimination based on sexual orientation, and at the same time we're seeing much worse mental health outcomes. So that's sort of just one hypothesis, and we'd love to see more research. This, of course, I'm a millennial, and so this is your token meme right over here, and I think it sort of really exemplifies this contrast at the middle, right, where it's people who identify as bisexual, queer, other non-monosexual identities are really stuck in this world where they're not finding acceptance and the supports that they need amongst their friends who might be straight or gay. And credit, of course, to Silky Sky Kitten from Tumblr. And of course, in the theme of today's event, we also wanted to look at differences by race. Now, I know some of us were feeling bad about always being relegated to other, but this is one where we all get to be other, because the comparison, because of our very, very small sample sizes, is a white, non-Hispanic, and all people of color, right? Because once again, we're looking primarily at sexual orientation, and within that, we're trying to look at any differences in race. What we find here is that some of the differences that were really strong when we did the previous analyses for bi+ people seem to not quite hold for people of color. So one thing you'll see is that when we look at caregiving for children, for example, there's not any meaningful differences amongst people of color who identify as bi+, lesbian or gay or straight, right? That's 12%, 8%, 10%. Similarly, we also looked at health outcomes, and once again, those significant differences, which are all the differences are significant for white bi+ respondents, but that completely disappears for people of color. One possibility is, of course, that we might just have a very low sample size. I will note that the mental health outcome still shows a magnitude difference, even if it's not statistically significant. But the physical health outcomes don't really appear to have a difference in the effect size either. So that raises a few questions about, is race a confounding factor that would trump the effect of sexual orientation, for example? I don't know. We should have further research. And so what we do see is that these are some of the differences that were appearing when we were looking at bi+ people in general, but once we started looking by race, those differences started to disappear. And that, I think, has some really interesting ramifications for how we understand even delivery of policy programs, right? If we're thinking about federal spending on caregiving, if we're thinking about healthcare delivery mechanisms, what are the messages that we are putting out there? How are we designing our policies so that people, regardless of sexual orientation, can feel welcome in those programs, right? And if there is an effect of race, how do we make it? How do we better understand why we're not seeing the difference? And how can we better understand how to serve those people who are people of color identifying as bi+? I think I have rushed through the presentation extremely quickly. Oh my God, that's absolutely fantastic. I will also very quickly say that if you need to contact me for any reason, don't forget to chirp. I am at @OhiShabab on Twitter. But the note that I did want to end on is this idea that people's bisexual identity will often be invalidated based on the fact that they might be married to someone of a different gender, based on the fact that they might be single, based on the fact that maybe they haven't had any partners in their life, right? And so what we want to really drive home is the fact that these people are still bisexual. Proud resident of Oregon, our governor, Kate Brown, first openly bisexual elected governor in the United States, among them who didn't have any particular reason to necessarily come out as bisexual after she'd been elected, but she did. And representation matters. But I think it's also about making sure that we're not invalidating anyone's identity. We're making room for all different ways of being to be present at the table. And with that, I will hand it over to my discussant.
Do you have a presentation?
Yeah, somewhere there. It's a PDF.
Yeah. Okay. There we go.
Thank you. It's hard to be the last comment, but we do have a panel, so I'm going to. So what I'm going to do, hang on, just, how do I get this? First of all, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I think this has been a really interesting day. I had to skip out for a short while to another session, but then I've been listening very carefully about a number of issues. We've heard a lot today about the policy need for data disaggregation in order to develop good policies, in order to understand what's actually going on so that we can be more targeted in how we make our rules and regulations. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that. I'm going to divide my comments into two. One are sort of just general comments from my point of view. I do work in innovation and entrepreneurship, and so I'm always very interested in what actually is going on in the mechanisms that drive certain outcomes. Some of my work in innovation and healthcare, for example, is always focused on trying to understand, what leads to equity, or what leads to outcomes in the healthcare space. And then with a little bit less time, I will maybe focus on some specific comments with respect to what has just been presented. So in terms of general comments, one of the things that I think we need to sort of keep in front of ourselves, right, when we develop these research questions is, why we disaggregate beyond sort of the policy-driven reasons is that as scholars, we are looking for mechanisms, right? So we're always trying to understand, what is the theoretical, number one, what is the theoretical rationale for disaggregating, and can we discover a theoretical mechanism if we disaggregate? Right. Otherwise, what we end up with, and I'm very sensitive to the early comments this morning that basically says, when we are disaggregating, we always run the risk of disaggregating ad infinitum to very, very small cell sizes, in which case then, we are not going to find either very strong effects or very meaningful effects. So I think, to my mind, in all of these, especially the empirical studies that we've been looking at, from my standpoint, I always start with the question, why, what's the mechanism here, right? What's causing these outcomes that we assume are being driven by the subgroups that we are interested in understanding a little bit about? So in that spirit, I think the other piece that is very important is understanding the size effect. Right? So a lot of times when we look at these studies, we look at obviously the correlations, we look at statistical significance, but obviously when you're looking at population level studies, you're gonna find statistical significance. So I'm always interested to know, well, what is in fact the size effect? And I think this comment becomes more important in my more specific comments with respect to this particular study. So the basis for defining the subgroup, I mean, we've heard a lot about sort of the policy-driven implications for why do we care about this subgroup, et cetera, and what do we know about the experiences of a particular subgroup with respect to, the larger group. But there are also, I think, subgroups, and this study illustrates very well, which is, on the one hand, self-definitional. I mean, I define my identity, right? But that is also not necessarily stable. We don't know, right? So when we are studying over time, we need to find a way, I think when we are disaggregating data over time, we need to find a way also how, especially the self-identified subgroups, might be dynamic over time, It's not the same people. So the very first study empirical study that was presented, in which they basically followed a fixed group over time, that's one way to solve that. But if we're simply looking at cross sections over time, then we always run into this problem where the identified subgroups are themselves dynamic. So what are we actually seeing when we find statistical relationships? And that's always sort of very concerning to me, at least, as an empiricist. And then are there limits? I'm not sure, but are there limits to how we subcategorize? So for example, if we're looking at say bisexual men, right? So you've got men as one group and then bisexual identity as another group. So the intersection between these two might be a group or may not be meaningful. And I think the study today was very illustrative of that, in which you find more similarities along certain dimensions between straight and gay, monogender people versus non-monogender people, right? So I think that's actually very important. And we go back to this, well, why do we, from a theoretical standpoint, is there a mechanism that we can at least conjecture about that might then give us the basis for making, these subgroup differences? So, I'm not going to talk about the risk in disaggregating. I think that's been talked about a lot already. But for me, the biggest risk is, I think, conflating cause and effect. This is the standard endogeneity problem, but I think there are sort of ways to solve that statistically, as well as, I think, starting with sort of good theory, good conjectures that we test. Now, the policy utilization of disaggregated data research. So this piece, I think, is important. Now, generally in health services research, we are looking to compare, say, an intervention against some benchmark. The typical benchmark is cost effectiveness, right? So is this intervention more or less cost effective than a standard intervention, an existing intervention, an alternative intervention? So I would like to sort of see discussions on what would that benchmark be if, from a health standpoint, right, if we are disaggregating the data. So by looking at the impact of, let's say, a policy intervention on a subgroup, right, that we believe is meaningful, that somehow experiences a health policy differently, what would then be the appropriate benchmark to compare them against the other groups? I think that's important. I like cost effectiveness because it's very well defined, but there might be other outcomes that one needs to measure. Now, specific comments to this study. Again, I realize it's not designed to be an academic study, so my comments need to be taken in that fashion. I think what this study does, or what these data do, is sort of create interesting questions that allow us to then actually study the phenomenon much deeper. So, as has been mentioned by Shabab, the bi plus definition is self-defined, right? It's based on a survey, and the respondents say, I'm bi, I'm not bi, I'm bi-male, I'm bi-female. That's important, but what would be important is for then the survey to be followed up upon, and if somehow it is possible to actually identify these individuals and to see if in fact that definition, over a life course remains stable or not, whether the household situation changes or not. That's also, I think, going to be very important, especially when you're talking about things like caregiving, income, workforce participation, right? Because you could imagine that an individual whose self-identification might change over time might also face very different kinds of outcomes, over time. The sample size, I might be wrong, but I believe it was 135 individuals over a surveyed population of 1,800. So that's sort of small. So statistically, I would sort of worry a little bit about that. So the question there would be the effect size question. Well, how big is the effect size? So, and then once you start dividing it into smaller and smaller cells, then your statistical power starts to. So the only, I guess, suggestion there is in the next survey, try to hit a larger sample size, but that's sort of neither here nor there. I mean, all of us as statisticians sort of understand that. Now, what is interesting to me, actually, and this goes back to the discussion about mechanisms. The survey found that bi plus individuals have poorer outcomes but experience less discrimination. And you started getting into an explanation why that's the case. See, that's interesting, right? So if you're going to disaggregate and you discover these things, then the next step to my mind is to start thinking what is going on there. Because the standard assumption is that among this community, or at least among the sort of non-monosexual community, one mechanism for why they might experience poorer outcomes could be discrimination, but that's not the case here. So what is the mechanism? What's the channel? What's going on? So in that sense, basically this calls for more research, right? Not only just more disaggregated data, but actually a lot more fine-grained data on demographics, so on and so forth. And then finally, I just wanted to add something in respect to healthcare research. You know, one of the fastest emerging areas, at least in medicine, and in public health, is epigenetics. So that's another sort of slice of the data, if you will. But what we are starting to find is that at the epigenetic level, that there might in fact be a lot more similarities, even across our standard definitions of race and gender and so on, than there are differences. I mean, we share 99.99% of our DNA, right? That 0.001% could account for a lot of differences. But let's not forget the 99.999%, because a lot of stuff is going on there as well. And certainly in medical science, that's what we're finding. Thank you.
Sure thing. I'll keep the response short. I thank you so much for those very detailed comments, and I think it was very interesting things to think about. Particularly to the point about effect size, I think that's why we've focused more on the differences that we found, to talk about the differences as meaningful rather than getting too much into how large those differences might be, because I don't think we quite have the confidence to say that. I would love to do a longitudinal survey of LGBTQ people over time. If anyone has the funding, please do let me know. But I think it goes to what we're talking about all throughout today, right? Is when we're looking at these very small populations, finding that really granular data is such a challenge. And one we continue to face. But what I will say is there's lots of surveys that all of you may be commissioning now or in the future. And if you want to talk about how to include questions around sexual orientation or gender identity in a meaningful way, please don't hesitate to reach out. We have plenty of experts who've tested questions to figure out what works best in different contexts, right? The best practices for a health survey that has HIPAA protections might look very different from a population survey, right? So that's one thing to think about as well. And I think on the note of definitions changing over time, I think that's completely true. One thing I just wanted to add as a comment perhaps is I want to be mindful of how definitions for a lot of different identities do change over time, right? When we think about people being disabled, your condition might be temporary, your condition might be something that changes with age, your condition might be something that has a cure or treatment such that it is no longer disabling to you. So I think it is important to think about how there are many different identities that can change over time. I mean, even with family dynamics, as Phil pointed out, and I want to think about how we don't view sexual orientation differently than other identities that also might change over time. I would love to take some questions. Thank you.
It goes to the very last point you made about definitions changing over time. So one of the most interesting things in time series data when we work with is the idea of the idea of persistence. If I want to say over time a change in these factors has resulted in this outcome, I want to make sure the definition of those factors are the same, but they have changed. So since identity is socially constructed and socially reported, do you have any ways in which, if we find in 2020, bi plus people trying to get capital for entrepreneurial ventures, there is no difference between bi plus and general population. But in 2025, we find that bi plus people are one standard deviation to the left either in the cost of capital they get or in their access to capital if they're trying entrepreneurial ventures. Somebody could object and say that's because the self-identified BIPLUS successful people no longer call themselves BIPLUS, or because of exclusion criteria, inclusion criteria, people that have dropped out, people that have dropped in. Are there ways in which that you can think of to control for these factors that make longitudinal data meaningful when persistence cannot be assured?
That's a really good point, and I'm thinking back to the U.S. transgender survey, which I was fortunate enough to be involved with, which it was a convenient sample, but was also the largest ever study of transgender people in the world, possibly. And one of the things where they looked at was people who, at a fixed moment in time, might identify as transgender, but they're looking at experiences across their entire life. So once again, we're only looking at self-reported data, but when you're asking people about, did you experience this in the past year? Did you experience this at any point in your lifetime? Did you experience this while you were in school or in college? Those are some ways that we can get at previous experiences. So it's not quite the same as tracking that same group over time, but these are some ways where you can look at your identity is fixed at this point, but we're looking at past behavior. So that's sort of like a roundabout way to get at getting at that. Aside from that, I know there's some efforts to do longitudinal surveys that might lend some interesting information. Unfortunately, we don't have a ton that we can play with right now. But I'd be happy to chat about the ideas that are coming right now. There was another hand over here.
I'm interested in, so I've been working with I don't know if you were there when he was there, but for a former colleague of yours, Colin Baker, on the Health Equity and Accountability Act data disaggregation title that, among a number of other things, would require federal health surveys to collect SOGI data. And so, I mean, we've been talking a lot about race and ethnicity data collections, which are included in the ACSs, et cetera, of the world. But of course, sexual orientation, gender identity information is not, and you have to do kind of these surveys, as well as the transgender survey, which have more limited methodological. So I'm kind of interested in how you would see the world of this data transform if that was a requirement of federal data collection, much like race and ethnicity is, as well as kind of, I mean, there are potentially other concerns as well for that, what that might look like. So how that would kind of change the environment your research is looking into.
Thank you so much, and I think that's a really important question. One thing I'll push back a little bit on is this is already happening, and we're really pleased to see that the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, YRBSS, is one that already collects sexual orientation and gender identity information. Well, I should say already collects sexual orientation information. The gender identity bit, I think the 2017 was the first where they had statistically significant findings. And we've already seen that, I mean, the way Gen Z is identifying in terms of sexual orientation and gender identity is inviting us to think about it in completely new ways. There's been this great hesitation to ask people younger than 13 or 14 about sexual orientation and gender identity, and now researchers are trying to think about how we can actually ask them those questions. As part of larger surveys which ask children questions where they say, you might not understand the question right now, but we'll keep asking you this every 2 years for the next 10 years, and then maybe we'll look at some answers that way. So I think there are some efforts being made to change that. In terms of how we do this and roll it out at a federal level, I would direct you to another thing that my colleagues put together, the LGBT Data Inclusion Act, which really outlines how to do this in a responsible manner, and looks at how different federal agencies can identify ways to collect the data that makes sense to them. Once again, I think in a lot of these health contexts where we're already seeing that with the BRFIS, the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System, the youth version of that, there are a lot of these different surveys where SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, information is already being collected. And I'd love to see that be expanded to things like the ACS. Right now, all we can do with the ACS is identify same-sex couple households, which is a sixth of the LGBTQ community. We can say a lot of things about that 1/6, but we can't say much about the other 5/6, right? So as we think about trying to disaggregate within the LGBTQ community, it would be wonderful if, surveys about employment, about home ownership, if all of those started asking SOGI questions as well. Thank you so much.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.